Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Babylon's Ashes, which is Book 6 of the Expanse book series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every book in the Expanse book series. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for up to Book 6 of the Expanse series. If you haven't read up to this book, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you, and that especially applies for those who are watching the show who haven't read any of the books or haven't read up to past book 3. You definitely don't want to watch this video because this will contain heavy spoilers for the future of the show that the show definitely has not covered yet. Continuing on to Babylon's Ashes, which is by all accounts part 2 of a two-parter which was started in Nemesis game. And this is the first time the Expanse has really done this, and I talked about this last time, how usually the novels were all standalone, and this is the first time like one novel really bled into another, where it felt like a definitive two-parter. And I chalked it up to the influence of the TV show. So this book was being written about the same time that season 2 of The Expanse was being written, and the authors, Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, were heavily involved in the creation of the show. And you know, in interviews they said that didn't really affect them. That didn't influence them because they're able to separate like the book and the show. And I watched one of those interviews again. The way Daniel Abraham talked about it, he made it clear is like that the Amos in the show is a bit different than the Amos in the book. They have different characteristics. They have a different feel to them. And he was really good at keeping those separate and writing Amos in the novels the way book Amos comes out and not confusing him with his TV show counterpart. And that I can totally agree with. I can totally see. I can see his point, and I think I totally believe him, and I think they actually do a very good job of keeping those things separate. But what I was talking about in my review of Nemesis games is that the themes and the tone of the show, I think, is bleeding into the novels at this stage, whether they want to admit it or not. Because this novel and the previous novel both have a lot feel more like the show. Like the characters still like the characters. Like Holden in the books is not like Holden in the show. So that he was right. That part of the show didn't influence them. But the part where it has this darker tone that, and the OPA is sort of more of a terrorist group, and that it has multiple focuses, especially this book. Where it has multiple focuses on multiple storylines and not just two characters, or not just the Viewpoint characters. We take the focus everywhere. And also the fact that the show is continuous, where it's not really self-contained, where all the other books were, where this book is more of that, where it's a cog in the story rather than a standalone novel. So in that case, I do believe that the show had definitely influenced, and I do believe working on the show definitely influenced the authors when writing this novel. Now, let's talk about the multiple Viewpoint characters, because this was the first novel in the Expanse series that didn't have like a set amount of Viewpoint characters where we just follow those Viewpoint characters throughout the entire novel. Like in the first novel, it was just Holden and Miller. And then ever since then, they had 4 Viewpoint characters, like books 2, 3, 4, and 5, all had 4 Viewpoint characters that they followed throughout repeatedly. This is the first book where there weren't a set amount of Viewpoint characters. We just followed the Viewpoint characters just changed, and we just followed whoever. I mean, we would follow the same character throughout the chapter, but once that chapter is over, we have no idea who we're going to follow. Now, if I had to pin down who we followed the most in this novel, I would definitely say Holden, Michio Pa, Philip. I would say those 3 were sort of main go-tos that we followed throughout most of the story. But then again, you know, sometimes they'll switch to Bobby Draper, sometimes Alpha Sorella, sometimes Naomi, sometimes Alex, sometimes Amos. We got a few Prax chapters. We got a few chapters from Dolls, which is very interesting. And I think 1 or 2 Marco Inaro's chapters as well. And we also got chapters from various characters on Medina Station. So, and I think there might be a few I'm leaving out. We had the prologue with Anna's wife and the epilogue with Anna herself. So, yeah, we're really jumping all over the place. And what I want to make clear is I like that. I really like this novel. And I actually do think this is one of my more favorite novels. I think this is one of the better novels, and part of the reason is because it didn't limit itself to 4 specific Viewpoint characters, particularly with Cibulo Byrne, because that introduced like 3 characters who weren't really that interesting, and so I think the Viewpoint characters was definitely the weak point of that novel. Whereas here, they don't limit itself, and so we get and that's why it feels more like the show, because the show would focus more on Alpha Sorella, Holden, and Miller, but then we get, you know, flashbacks to Fred Johnson's past, or we see these people in the station, or this kid in the ship, so the show wouldn't be afraid to go wherever, and that's what this novel does as well. It's not afraid to just go wherever it wants to, and it's also really cool. Even though they were established in the previous novel as they were main Viewpoint characters, is the Rocinante crew, namely Amos and Alex, that they get more interplay, and sometimes we get their chapters instead of always getting a Holding chapter and seeing everything from his perspective, which was also really cool. So I did really enjoy this novel, and the other thing I really liked about this novel is the fact that it's part 2 of 2, is that it didn't have that slow build up that most novels, the Expanse novels, have. Instead, it just went straight. You were like smack straight into the story. Like even the first couple of chapters had some amazing, like, you know, action sequences when they were attacking the ship that were guiding the rocks into Earth and stuff like that, and get immediately into the political situation. We didn't have to spend time setting up the characters and setting up the situation like what every book has done, particularly the first 4. I mean, last book they didn't have to take time to set up the characters as such because we're already familiar with Alex, Amos, and the Rocinante crew and all that, but they still had to set up the situation a bit, and they got into the backstories, whatever. Where here we just, and especially the first 4 books, where they had to set up each and every character. Who is Clarissa Mao? Who is, you know, Elvie? And what is this current situation? We had to take a lot of time to set that up. Whereas this novel, we didn't have to take any time to set up the current situation. We knew what the situation was. Because it happened in the previous book, Marco Arnaus has, you know, obliterated Earth, and Earth is in like dire straits. They're pretty much to have an extinction level events, and he's taking over in the outer planets because the UN's too busy dealing with what's going on Earth. And Mars, of course, had a massive mutiny where I think half or maybe a third of their military resources were just up and left and went through the gate, so they're in disarray as well. So Marco Arnaus is taking advantage of this and trying to run rampant in the belt and keep the belt there for more of the extreme elements of the OPA. And also this novel deals with him sort of taking over the OPA and how he's trying to get some of the more moderate elements of the OPA in line with his vision. And I like, in one point, they had this line where he says, "Oh, moderate OPA, that's just another way to say traitor," which is very much the perspective of someone who is an extremist, and that they think anyone who is a moderate is just a traitor or just wrong, because if you don't agree with their extremist point of view, then you're wrong. So even if you're on technically the same side. So I really love the characterizations, the way they portrayed all these characters, and I think the storyline itself. Now, I think when I talked about how each novel sort of has a different theme or different tone. How the first novel was a detective noir, second novel was a political thriller, third novel was apparently a haunted house. I don't really see it, but in the fourth novel, definitely a western. And last novel, I think I chalked out more to a mystery. This novel, I think, is more of a war story, and I don't say that it's and. So it might come off similar to Caliban's War as in the political thriller, but it's not quite the same thing. It's not quite the same as a political thriller, which is, when I think of that, I think of stuff like Tom Clancy novels, like the whole Jack Ryan thing, or James Bond and stuff like that. Those are political thrillers, but this wasn't that. It wasn't a political thriller. It was more of a flat-out strategic war story where we have this specific war going on with Marco Arnauis trying to run rampant in the belt, and he cut off the Sol system from the rest of the gates where there's tons of human colonies out there, and they're cut off from everything. So it's a strategic situation. So that's why I think it definitely works for this novel a lot, how we jump into a bunch of different characters from all different sides. Like, we see Dahl's perspective at one point, we see Marco Arnauis' perspective, we see Alva Sorella's perspective, we see Robert Draper, we see Holden. Like, I love how they jump because it adds to the strategic theme of this novel. So this I would say is more of a flat out war, even though it's not like, it's hard to say because it's not like a war in the sense, if you think of movies like where you just go to the Vietnam War and you see people killing each other. It's not in that sense. It's more of the strategic sense of the people who are planning for it. So again, that's why some people might say, oh, it's the same as a political thriller. But that's not that. Those political thrillers deal more with like conspiracies and spies and stuff. But this is more of a war situation, but seen from the strategic perspective rather than the on-the-ground gritty perspective, if you know what I'm saying, if I'm explaining this right. But anyway, that's how I see this novel, and I really like that's another thing I really like about this novel, so that it can't be that well defined, that it's its own unique thing that has a lot of really interesting, unique characters. So now let me start getting into that. Let's start with Michio Powell, because I think she is probably one of the most interesting characters in this novel, because she was introduced in the third book, Abaddon's Gate, and we hadn't seen her in the novel since then. It was interesting to go back to her and how much she's changed since that time, because at this point in time she hates Fred Johnson. She always refers to him as Fred fucking Johnson and thinks that he was a traitor, but when we last saw her she was working for him, but yet she was really young, and it seems like, and she was made the first officer of the Behemoth mainly because she was a belter, and Fred Johnson mainly did this as a political move, and it seems like as she got older she learned of that, and she resented it and thought that he forced her into a position of command too early when she wasn't ready for it, and so she held that against him. And so she begins the novel as we're on Marco Arnauis' side, as she's agrees with his ultimate goal that the ring gates are going to make the belters go extinct and nobody cares. And so and which of course is vindicated at the end of the novel, which is a valid viewpoint. And so she starts out as a pirate, basically, where she's going to the colony ships that are trying to go to through the ring gates and just ransacking their sources so they can redistribute them throughout the belt. So it's interesting seeing that perspective, because you give Fred Johnson and Alva Sorella, think of her as scum. She's an outright pirate. She kills people. She steals the resources, which is basically, sentenced them to death. But from her perspective, she is preventing a genocide that's going on from the Belter and helping to redistribute and to heal people and to save lives by taking these much needed resources and distributing them through the belt. where they belong. And I think her personal story is something that we really didn't get much into. Now, something I didn't like how they tried to imply in retrospect that she was romantically involved with Sam during the events of Abaddon's Gate. I mean, there's nothing in Abaddon's Gate that directly contradicts that. I just don't see that. I think that's retrospect changing things around. I think that's kind of bullshit, and especially since the dynamic that these two had, where Michio Pa was punishing Sam for sticking up for Bull, but they tried to say in retrospect, oh, she felt betrayed because they were lovers. I hated that, I'll be honest. But other than that, that's like the only thing. But other than that, because I don't like when people try to retroactively change stuff that already happened in the past. But anyway, I do love the way they developed her personal story in this novel, where she's a part of a polyamorous marriage. So, like, she has multiple partners. I think 3 women and 4 men. So I think there's 8 of them. So 4 women and 4 men altogether, including her, if I remember correctly. And that was such an interesting dynamic, and I love the way it was kind of different than. Is similar to what they described as Holden's parents, how he was sort of part of a cooperative, but that was kind of described a bit differently, because all of his parents were married, but they weren't necessarily all in a romantic or sexual relationship with each other. It was they kind of paired off, and they just married as a group for like financial, administration purposes. They weren't all necessarily in a romantic relationship together, whereas Michio Pa's collective was definitely described as they're all in romantic and sexual relationships with each other. And so that was very interesting, and I did like how they sort of played at that and developed these characters and had developed the relationships they had with each other. And of course, Michio Pa's character journey throughout the novel was very interesting. How she starts to realize that Marco Inaros is not a good guy, because then he starts these resources that she wants to redistribute to the Belters to help save lives. He wants to hoard them for strategic purposes, and then he uses tactics like abandoning thousands of people in series just to, has a strategic tactic. She's totally not for. And plus, getting to know the guy personally, she can see how much of an egotist and megalomaniac this guy actually is. So she's smart enough to realize that she's joined the wrong side. So she eventually has to go ally herself with Fred fucking Johnson, which is the last thing she wants to do, and Alva Sorella, the people she saw as her biggest enemies. But she realized that they weren't as big of a threat to the belt as Marco Inaros has become. And so she ends up actually switching sides. And of course, at first, Fred Johnson and Alva Sorella totally against it. They want nothing to do. She's a pirate. What the hell is your problem? We can't ally ourselves with it. But Holden is a voice of reason. He's like, look, she's in the position to help us the most. This is like the biggest advantage, strategic advantage we could possibly have. It would be idiotic to not take advantage of that out of moral objections. And I love that Holden was the one to do that. And I love how this happened in the Naomi chapter, because Naomi, when she heard of this idea, she thought, oh, Holden's going to be totally against it, and he's not going to be for it, and he's going to reject it out of hand because he's Mr. Moral. He's all about his morals, and he has blinders on when it comes to right and wrong. But turns out that as much as Naomi thinks she knows Holden, she was actually wrong about him, that he has evolved to the point to be able to see the gray areas and be able to look past what is simply right and wrong and see the bigger picture and what would be best for everyone. And of course, this translates towards the end of the novel when Holden comes up with the idea for the merchant navy, or whatever it is they call it, that the guild, merchant guild or whatever, so the transferring the Belters into a transport service, basically, so that they can it fits into because Marco Inaros' vision was doomed to failure, because his vision was just to deny the ring gates exist and to try to block them up, and which is never going to work, because the desire, the need, the want for expansion was so strong that there's no way, even he could hold it off for a couple decades, maybe even if he tried, but there's no way he could curtail it entirely, so his method was doomed to failure. So Holden comes up with a better idea to prevent the Belters from going extinct by integrating them into the new system. Yes, the ring gates are going to be there. The colonies are going to exist. Nothing you can do about it. So let's find a way to fit the Belters into this new dynamic. And so he comes up with this idea of the guild, which I think was brilliant. And I love how Sorella tried to make him in charge of it, and he was like, no, no, no. And he pointed to Pa, and Pa was shocked that he was pointing to her, and he was saying that she would be perfect for it. And you can see how Sorella would not be for that, because, you know, again, she's a pirate. How dare you? But Holden was smart enough to see that you can't put an Earther in charge of this, that it needs to be a Belter, not just any Belter. It needs to be someone that the Belters trust and looked after. And I love how Holden told Naomi later that if Pa wasn't there, that he would have nominated her. And she's like, well, there's no way I would have taken it. And he's like, really? If it came down to it, you would have rather, you know, let this thing fall apart? And she had to think about that. And it's like, okay, maybe, but she definitely wouldn't have wanted it. But they talked about how Pa didn't really want it either, but that it was definitely what needed to happen. Now, speaking of Naomi, let's get more into her storyline, because she didn't factor as strongly in this novel as she did in the previous novel, because I thought her character story in the previous novel was very strong, with her having to abandon her son and the issues she had, abandonment issues she had with her son, how the way her son and, his father viewed her was totally different than the person she actually was. Like, they had this weird vision of who she was. And I love how that is explored a bit more in this novel, maybe not focused on as much, but I love how Naomi has to come to the decision to leave, to basically kill Philip, or at least let him die, or at least not be that concerned, because they addressed this. Marco Inaros purposely contacted Holden so he could see Philip, and purposely did that so that Holden would hesitate in killing him, because he could see that this was Naomi's son, and it worked. And Holden disarmed the missiles, and that could have actually destroyed the Pella, which would have done a lot of good to get rid of Marco. But instead, they hesitated because of Philip, and so they hashed it out. He had this conversation with Naomi, and it was a really good scene. It was a really deep character scene, and they both had to come to the realization that they needed to make the conscious decision to not save Philip, that would interfere, that would be a direct hindrance with their war against Marco Inaros. And he knew that, which is why he was playing that card, because he's a very smart, very strategic guy. So that was a very interesting storyline. And of course, at the end, Naomi actually believes. Now, this is partly frustrating to me, because even to this point that we're at, and when I'm making this video at the end of book 7, she still believes that her son Philip is dead, and that he died when all of the Marco's ships, when she made them all disappear with the thing, which by the way was really cool. But so she believes that he was on that ship, and that he died with his father. But in actuality, he didn't get on the ship, and it was Philip's character journey was really interesting for this novel too, because he starts the novel thinking his mother's dead, so he hates Holden, puts all his anger on hatred on him, saying it's his fault. But then when he finds out that she's alive, she now hates her for faking her death in order to escape, and now so he has this hatred towards her. But during the character journey through the novel, he slowly starts to come around to Naomi's point of view, and starting to see Marco the way that she sees him, and this because Marco is definitely he's a very good military man. He's a very good strategist. He's very good at building alliances and getting people to follow him. It's described in this novel a lot, and the previous novel, is very charismatic, but he ultimately is a selfish asshole. He's kind of a megalomaniac. And that's the side that Naomi has been able to see since she was with him decades ago, and that's shows he knows that's who he is. But it's, during the course of the novel, we start to get the feel. Philip starts to see this as well, and I like the way it's done. As when they have the battle with the Rocinante, when they try to destroy the Rocinante, but the Rocinante gets away, and because Marco made Philip like the gunman or attack officer or whatever, he totally puts the blame on Philip. He's like, this is your fault. Just admit, just say you fucked up like a man. When really it wasn't his fault. And I love that scene because he was thinking in his head, but it's not my fault. It was your fault. But he had to say it because he did the type of person that Marco was. And then later on, when it was found out that Fred Johnson died during that battle, he was all of a sudden, Philip, we did it, we're awesome, and Philip obviously, not okay with this, and so he starts to gender this very justified hatred towards Marco and start to see him in a new light, that he, in the same light that Naomi says, that he never takes responsibilities for his actions, that he always puts the blame onto other people, and it's always someone else's fault, never his. And part of his sort of megalomania, so Philip's getting a bigger picture of what that is. And I love how Philip starts to get a very, agitated with him for this. And I love, we go back to Marco's chapters, and he's completely oblivious to this, to the fact that what he just did to Philip about saying, admit it's your fault, you're a failure. Like, he doesn't even acknowledge that. To him, that's just part of it. And I think that he reminisces about how he was sort of treated badly or hazed when he was a kid, so he's just doing the same thing to Philip, and he's just, but he's really not getting like what he's actually doing to Philip. And so when Philip starts acting up, he just thinks Philip is just being a bratty little kid, so he just treats, and I love how he says, instead of like being violent or like trying to hit him or something like that, he just treats him like a little kid, tries to humiliate him as punishment for that. And it's sort of, it was really fascinating getting his perspective. Again, he has this weird vision of who Holden is and who Naomi is, and it was cool having his Viewpoint chapters, particularly the moment of his death. That was really cool. Speaking of death, we get Fred Johnson's death, which is quite a major character. He's been around since the very first novel. Never a Viewpoint character, never a main character, but he was always an important figure, and he did feature quite prominently in the previous book. Now, this is something that was actually spoiled. I spoiled for myself. I was reading like it was some sort of Wikipedia page or something, but I didn't realize it was just about the books. Like, I don't think it properly warned me that it contained heavy spoilers. So before I read the books, and after I just watched a couple seasons of the show, I saw that it said, oh, and Fred Johnson died and blah blah. And I was like, God damn it! So I tried not to remember the details because I didn't want to spoil myself too much. It was bad enough I already knew he died. I did try, so I tried to not read any of the details surrounding it and tried to sort of forget. So when I was reading, but I knew it was somewhere around this time, but I thought it was book 5. So when I was reading Nemesis Games, I kept expecting Fred Johnson to die. Actually, I thought I remembered it wrong. I thought that he died on Tycho Station. So I kept expecting, oh, this is when he's dying. And so when he survived that book, I was like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm remembering the spoiler incorrectly. Maybe he doesn't die. And then we get to this book. I was like, oh no, he does. I just got the book wrong. It's the following book, and he dies on the Rocinante. And it's very interesting that the way he died, that it was through a stroke, because they mention throughout all of the Expanse novels how dangerous space travel is, especially going in high G and high speeds, and how that could cause strokes. But we never really saw it. And to see it happen, not just to anyone, but to a very important character who is up there in age, so it makes sense that it could happen to him in the middle of a very heated battle where they're having to travel very fast at very high speeds in order to survive. And it turns out that he is stroked out. So that, and the impact that it had, and how Holden had to sort of assume his role. And I love how Holden kept saying, telling everyone it was Fred Johnson's plan. Dawes even got everyone to go along with it because he thought it was Fred Johnson's plan, but it wasn't. It was actually Holden's plan. He was just lying. So that was really cool. That created a really nice dynamic. Now, inevitably in any of the Expanse novels, there's always low points to the novels, as I said. Like, for me, like, book 2 was the Prax chapters, which I didn't really care for. Book 3 was the Anna chapters, which I didn't care that much for. And book 4 is the LV chapters. And I think book 5, I said it was like the first part of Amos's story, and most of the first part of Alex's story I didn't really care about. This novel, it was, again, the Prax chapters. He only had like 3 or 4 chapters, though. But they were totally unnecessary. Like, they added nothing to the story overall. It was just, I think it was just a way to play into nostalgia. So people were like, hey, this is what happened to Prax. He remarried, or I don't know if he was married, but he was with another woman who had her own daughter. And he, of course, had May, so that he had now had 2 daughters to look after. And he was looking at their botanist team. They were trying to create a special something, germ or weed or whatever that they could grow on to help facilitate growing food on Earth because people were starving. And how the Free Navy was taking over Ganymede, so he had to live in this sort of Gazapo type society where he was trying to hide from it, where people were just getting killed for being suspected of being traitors. It was kind of interesting, I guess, but it didn't contribute to the overall story. It had nothing to do with how, the war turned out. And ultimately, like, whenever I went to these Prax chapters, I was really bored, and I was just waiting for it to be over. I didn't think we need to see him again. I'm sorry. And I don't think the show's going to do this. I think if we ever see him in the show, he's going to take the role of a different character. Just my guess. And the other chapters I didn't really care for that much were the Medina Station chapters before Holden and the others came into attack. Because I don't know, dude, they just got thrown so many names at us, and we followed mostly unimportant characters like the janitor or the mechanic or whatever, instead of like anyone in a position of power. And they focus on a different character every time, which to me, I don't know, maybe I'm just dense or whatever. It's hard for me to follow, but for me, I didn't really get a grasp on who any of these people were. I didn't recognize the names. Every time I got to these chapters, I was like, who's this person? Who's that person? I don't know. I don't care. I mean, the only good thing, I don't know if those chapters really need to be there. I mean, the only good thing is that it did further establish the relationship that they had with Duarte. And Marcus people in Duarte, which I thought was interesting. And then, but I really did love the battle sequences at the end when they took over Medina Station, and how that all played out. Bobby Draper had to do the thing with the gun and crashing it into the station. Like, yeah, that was all amazing. And how they were then, once they took the station, they were in like a no-win scenario because Marco Naros was gathering all his forces and burning straight toward them, and there was nothing they can do, and so they were sort of in a dead-end scenario. And then they finally came up, which tied into this investigation from the previous novel about how some ships just disappeared in the middle of ring gates, and they figured out the why that was, and more importantly, how to duplicate that, and that's how they ended up defeating Marco, which I thought was awesome. That was really good stuff. And it is interesting, and I did notice when my previous review of the previous novel, I talked about how the Duarte kind of just came out of nowhere, and I didn't really get who he was until I read it the second time. Like, it's because I knew from the later novels that he'd become more important. This novel makes it a bit more clear. I still stand by my statement that it could have been more clear in the previous novel about who he was and what was going on. But this novel, they do set it up that, and you do get the impression that he knew Marco Naros would fail, even though he was sending support. But that he had contingencies to when he'd fail. Because I think he knew that Marco, as I said, Marco's plan to just cut off the ring gates forever not sustainable. It's not practical. And I think he knew that, but he was mainly supported Marco and allowed him to. He actually, because Marco wouldn't have been able to pull off what he did without Duarte's help, but Duarte was able. The reason why he did help Marco is because he provided much needed distraction to get away. Because although Marco would not have been able to pull off what he did without Duarte's help, Duarte wouldn't have been able to pull off what he did without Marco's distraction. So he needed Marco, and like destroying Earth and having an extinction level defense. That's quite a distraction, and so that's something that Duarte needed in order to get away. And of course, we'll see in the future novels that actually becomes quite a big deal. But I don't want to spoil anything about that. I'll cover that when I get to the next novel. But it was a good setup, I will say. Anyway, so my rating for Babylon's Ashes out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. I really enjoyed this novel. It was great that it got right to the point, didn't have any boring setup or filler, but it still had a lot of great character development, a lot of great character moments. I love what they did with Michio Pa, with Philip's storyline, with Naomi's storyline, and I love like the whole through plot. It was very exciting and engaging, so I think definitely an excellent novel. Anyway, that is it for my review of Babylon's Ashes. I'll be back in roughly 3 weeks to review book 7, which I can't really pronounce. I'll try to pronounce it next week or next time when I do the review for that. But this is all, of course, leading up to the release of book 8 in March. So just a month or so away from that, which I'll definitely do a review for that when that comes out. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. You should check out my channel as I do many more videos on The Expanse, as well as covering many other TV shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Discovery, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.